The old man's Vietnam War jacket hit the concrete with a wet slap as 16-year-old Tyler Brennan's fist connected with weathered ribs, sending the 73-year-old veteran crashing against the graffiti-covered bus shelter in downtown Portland. "Look at this old loser," Tyler laughed, his voice carrying the cruel confidence of youth that had never faced real consequences. His friends, Jake Morrison and Danny Chen, circled the fallen man like hyenas, their phones already out, to record what they thought would be viral entertainment, wearing his little costume like anyone gives a shit about Vietnam. The veteran, Robert Bobby Martinez, though the boys didn't know his name, tried to pull himself upright using the bus shelter's metal frame, his arthritic fingers struggling, for purchase on the icy December morning. Blood trickled from his split lip, staining his gray beard crimson. The Purple Heart pin on his jacket caught the weak Oregon sunlight, a small defiance against the humiliation. "Please," Bobby whispered, his voice hoarse from decades of cigarettes and Agent Orange exposure. "I just want to go home." "Home to what?" Danny sneered, grabbing the old man's worn duffel bag and dumping its contents onto the sidewalk. Prescription. Bottles scattered like dice, medications for PTSD, chronic pain, and the dozen other invisible wounds that followed soldiers home from wars that America preferred to forget. Living in some shitty apartment collecting welfare checks, Tyler kicked one of the pill bottles into the gutter, watching it disappear into the storm drain with satisfaction. "My dad says Vietnam vets are just drug addicts who couldn't handle a real war. Says they came back broken because they were weak to begin with." The words hit Bobby harder than the physical blows. He'd heard variations of this cruelty for 50 years, from protesters who spat on him at the airport in 1969, from employers who wouldn't hire damaged goods, from a society that had sent him to fight and then blamed him for surviving. But it never stopped hurting, never stopped feeling like fresh shrapnel in old wounds. Jake moved in for his turn, grabbing Bobby's jacket and shoving him harder against the shelter. The impact sent pain shooting through the veteran's bad hip, the one that had been reconstructed after a mortar blast in Da Nang. "Should have stayed in the jungle, old man. Nobody wants you here." What happened next occurred so fast that Tyler's phone camera barely captured it. A figure in a dark gray hoodie emerged from behind the bus shelter's advertising display like a shadow given substance. Female, medium height, moving with the fluid precision of someone whose body was a weapon trained to kill. Her face was hidden beneath the hood, but her hands, quick, efficient, deadly, spoke of years of combat training at the highest levels. Tyler felt strong fingers close around his wrist before he could react, his grip on Bobby's jacket released, involuntarily as pressure points sent electric agony up his arm. The hooded woman twisted his wrist with surgical precision, dropping him to his knees in less than 2 seconds without making a sound. Danny tried to run, made it exactly 3 steps before the woman's leg swept his feet, sending him face first into the concrete with a crack that would require 12 stitches and leave a permanent scar. He lay moaning, blood pooling beneath his broken nose. Jake was the smartest of the 3, or at least the most experienced with violence. He'd done time in juvenile detention for assault, thought he understood how fights worked. He swung a wild haymaker that would have knocked out most opponents. The hooded woman caught his fist mid-swing, twisted his arm behind his back, and drove him to the ground in one smooth motion that belonged in Special Forces training videos. Jake's face hit the pavement so hard his teeth cut through his lip, and he tasted blood mixed with the bitter flavor of instant humiliation. The entire confrontation had taken less than 15 seconds. Tyler writhed on the ground, cradling his wrist and staring up at the woman who had dismantled 3 armed teenagers without breaking a sweat. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't shown her face, hadn't even appeared to exert herself beyond the minimal effort required to neutralize threats. "Who the fuck are you?" Tyler gasped, his voice cracking with pain and shock. The woman ignored him, instead turning to Bobby Martinez and extending a hand to help him stand. Her movements toward the veteran were gentle, respectful, the complete opposite of the efficient violence she'd just displayed. "You okay, sir?" Her voice was young, maybe early 20s, with the crisp diction of military training, southern accent, probably Texas or Georgia. Bobby accepted her help, rising slowly to his feet while studying the hooded figure who had appeared like an avenging angel. "I'm fine, miss. Thank you. You didn't need to." "Yes, I did." She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew something that made Bobby's breath catch in his throat. A military dog tag, worn and scratched, the kind that had seen combat in places where young Americans died for reasons that were still classified decades later. But it wasn't her dog tag. "Master Sergeant William Chen," she read aloud, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even Danny's moaning. "101st Airborne, Vietnam, 1967 to 1969, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart. Killed in action at Firebase Alpha, March 15, 1969. She looked down at the three teenagers who were slowly comprehending that they'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong person on the wrong day. "This was my grandfather's tag," she continued, her voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone that suggested violence was still very much on the table. "He was 19 when he died. Stepped on a mine while carrying a wounded soldier to safety. Saved 3 lives and lost his own." Tyler tried to stand, his bravado evaporating as the implications of what she was saying began to sink in. "Look, we didn't know." "Didn't know what?" She finally pulled back her hood, revealing the face of a young Asian American woman whose features carried both beauty and the hard edges of someone trained to kill. Her black hair was cut in a regulation style that spoke of military academy training. "Didn't know that the man you just assaulted and called a loser had more courage in his left thumb than you'll have in your entire worthless lives?" Danny struggled to sit up, blood still streaming from his nose. "We were just messing around. Messing around." She repeated the words like they tasted poisonous. "You attacked a 73-year-old veteran, destroyed his medication, and filmed it for social media entertainment. That's not messing around, that's assault, elder abuse, and theft." Jake was the first to really understand how much trouble they were in. The woman's military bearing, her combat skills, the way she spoke about the veteran with protective anger. This wasn't a random good Samaritan. This was someone with training, connections, and the kind of motivation that ended badly for people who hurt veterans. "Who are you?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would make everything worse. She reached into another pocket and withdrew a military ID card, holding it just long enough for them to read the text before sliding it away. What they saw made Tyler's remaining bravado disappear entirely. "Cadet Captain Sarah Chen, United States Military Academy at West Point, Special Operations Training Command, daughter of Army Colonel James Chen and granddaughter of Master Sergeant William Chen." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of Portland traffic and Danny's labored breathing through his broken nose. "West Point?" Tyler's voice came out as a croak. "Class of 2024, scheduled for Rangers training after graduation." She knelt beside Bobby Martinez, checking his injuries with the clinical efficiency of someone trained in combat medicine. "And before you ask, yes, my grandfather's name is on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Panel 23W, Line 47. I visit him every year on the anniversary of his death." The teenagers were beginning to understand that they hadn't just assaulted a random, homeless veteran. They'd attacked someone under the protection of a woman who had spent 4 years learning how to kill America's enemies, whose family had bled for the country across 3 generations, and who had both the training and the connections to make their lives very difficult. "Sir?" Sarah said to Bobby, helping him collect his scattered medications. "Do you need medical attention?" "I can call an ambulance." Bobby shook his head, though his hands were trembling from adrenaline and shock. "I'm okay, miss, just need to get home." "Where's home?" "Veterans housing about 6 blocks north." "I can walk." Sarah looked at the 3 teenagers who were still on the ground, nursing injuries and growing awareness of how thoroughly they'd been outmatched. "Actually, I think these young men would be happy to give you a ride. Wouldn't you, gentlemen?" It wasn't really a question. Tyler looked at his friends, then at the woman who had just demonstrated exactly how much damage she could inflict when motivated. "We don't have a car. Your friend Jake drove here in a blue Honda Civic. License plate 847JKM. Sarah's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had been observing them long before they'd noticed her. "You'll drive Mr. Martinez home?" apologize for your behavior, and then we'll discuss what happens next. Jake wanted to refuse, but something in Sarah's expression suggested that defiance would result in significantly more pain than compliance. Fine, whatever. The drive to Bobby's apartment complex was conducted in tense silence. 3 teenage bullies crammed into a Honda with a Vietnam veteran they'd just attacked and a special forces trainee who had thoroughly demolished their sense of invulnerability. Bobby sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at Sarah with gratitude and something approaching awe. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, as they pulled into the parking lot of a rundown apartment complex that housed disabled, veterans and other forgotten casualties of American military adventures. "Yes, I did." Sarah's response was immediate and certain. "My grandfather died so that people like you could come home alive. Protecting you honors his sacrifice." She walked Bobby to his apartment door, making sure he was safely inside before returning to the car where 3 teenagers sat contemplating the worst mistake of their young lives. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, leaning against the driver's side window. "You're going to delete any video you recorded of this incident. You're going to apologize to Mr. Martinez in writing, and you're going to perform 40 hours of community service at the local Veterans Affairs Hospital." "Or what?" Tyler tried to summon his earlier bravado, but failed miserably. Sarah smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than her earlier violence had been. "Or I upload the video I recorded to every social media platform I can find, along with your names, faces, and the story of how 3 coward teenagers attacked a Vietnam veteran for fun. Then I call my father, who happens to be the commanding officer of the 142nd Military Police Battalion, and suggest that local law enforcement might want to investigate this assault." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Then I call my friend at the Portland Tribune, who's always looking for stories about how America treats its veterans. Then I call my cousin who works for Channel 8 News. Then I start making phone calls to every high school in the area to make sure guidance counselors know exactly what kind of character you 3 demonstrate when you think nobody's watching." Danny wiped blood from his nose with a shaking hand. "You can't do that." "Can't I?" Sarah held up her phone, which had apparently been recording the entire encounter. "I've got video of the assault, your confession that it was premeditated entertainment, and audio of you calling a decorated veteran a drug addict and a loser, plus 3 witnesses who saw you destroy his medication and steal his personal property." The legal implications were starting to dawn on Jake, who had the most experience with the juvenile justice system. "That's assault, theft, elder abuse, and probably a hate crime since it was targeted at a veteran." "Very good," Sarah said with mock approval. "You do understand consequences after all." Tyler was beginning to panic as he realized how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. "Look, we're sorry, okay? We didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Sarah cut him off. "You meant to humiliate an old man for your own entertainment. You meant to destroy his property and film his suffering for social media likes. The only thing you didn't mean to do was get caught by someone who could fight back." She straightened up, her expression shifting from anger to something more calculating. "But I'm willing to make a deal. 40 hours of community service at the VA hospital, written apologies to Mr. Martinez, and you're going to spend every Friday evening for the next 6 months visiting veterans at the local nursing home." "6 months?" Danny protested. "Would you prefer federal charges?" Sarah's voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Because I can make that happen with 1 phone call." The 3 teenagers looked at each other, recognizing that they had been comprehensively defeated by someone who understood exactly how power worked in the real world. Sarah wasn't just physically superior. She had connections, training, and the moral authority of military service backing her demands. "Fine," Tyler said finally. "We'll do the community service." "And the nursing home visits?" "And the nursing home visits." "And the written apologies?" "Yes, goddammit, yes." Sarah nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. You'll report to the VA hospital this Saturday at 800 hours. Ask for volunteer coordinator Janet Walsh. She's a Marine veteran who'll make sure you understand exactly what service means." She turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. Oh, and gentlemen, if I hear about you bothering any other veterans, or if you fail to complete your community service, or if you decide to seek revenge against Mr. Martinez, you'll discover that West Point graduates have very long memories and very broad networks of fellow officers who take veteran welfare seriously. The threat hung in the air as Sarah walked away, disappearing around the corner of the apartment complex like the avenging spirit she'd seemed to be from the beginning. Tyler sat in the driver's seat, staring at his hands and trying to process what had just happened. In the space of an hour, he'd gone from filming what he thought would be viral entertainment to being comprehensively defeated by a woman half his size who'd turned their cruelty into a lesson about consequences. "Dude," Jake said finally, "we are so fucked." "She can't really do all that stuff, can she?" Danny asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Tyler thought about the way Sarah had moved, the certainty in her voice, the military ID that confirmed she wasn't bluffing about her connections. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She can do all of it." The community service at the VA hospital turned out to be more educational than punitive. Under Janet Walsh's supervision, the three teenagers spent their weekends helping elderly veterans with physical therapy exercises, reading to blind patients, and listening to stories from men who had seen combat in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The work was humbling in ways they hadn't expected. Tyler found himself pushing wheelchairs for Marines who'd lost legs to IEDs, discovering that the drug addicts and losers he'd dismissed were men who'd sacrificed pieces of themselves for abstract concepts like duty and honor that he'd never seriously considered. Danny, whose broken nose had healed crooked and left him with a permanent reminder of the encounter, spent his hours helping Vietnam veterans with PTSD navigate VA bureaucracy. He learned that the nightmares and flashbacks that had made these men seem crazy were actually normal responses to abnormal experiences. War zones where 19-year-olds watched their friends die in ways that civilian minds couldn't comprehend. Jake discovered that many of the veterans were younger than he'd expected. Iraq and Afghanistan wars had created a new generation of wounded warriors who'd returned to a country that supported the troops with words while cutting their benefits with budgets. The homeless veteran he'd mocked for living in government housing turned out to be a former Army Ranger who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. The Friday evening nursing home visits were even more transformative. Sitting with elderly veterans who had limited mobility and fewer visitors, the teenagers heard stories that weren't taught in history classes. Personal accounts of D-Day landings, Chosin Reservoir, the Tet Offensive, Operation Desert Storm, first-hand testimony from men who'd participated in events that shaped the modern world. Slowly, reluctantly, Tyler began to understand what Sarah Chen had been trying to teach them. The veterans they'd dismissed as losers and drug addicts were actually men who'd volunteered to face death so that people like him could live safely in a democracy. Their scars, physical and psychological, weren't signs of weakness but evidence of sacrifice. 6 weeks into their community service, Tyler encountered Bobby Martinez again at the VA hospital. The old veteran was there for his monthly appointment with a psychiatrist who helped him manage PTSD symptoms that had persisted for 50 years after his return from Vietnam. "I remember you," Bobby said, though his voice carried no anger. "You're one of the boys from the bus stop." Tyler felt shame burn in his chest like acid. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry about what happened." "You learning anything here?" The question caught Tyler off guard. He'd expected anger, maybe threats, certainly not genuine curiosity about his education. "Yeah," he said honestly. "I'm learning that I was wrong about a lot of things." Bobby nodded slowly. "Good. Being wrong ain't the worst thing in the world, as long as you're willing to learn from it." They talked for nearly an hour, Bobby sharing stories from Vietnam that weren't about combat heroics but about young men far from home, scared and trying to take care of each other in impossible circumstances. Tyler found himself understanding for the first time that war wasn't about politics or patriotism, as much as it was about ordinary people in extraordinary situations doing their best to survive and protect their friends. When their 6 months of community service was complete, All three teenagers had been fundamentally changed by the experience. Tyler had decided to study social work in college, motivated by his exposure to the VA's understaffed programs for homeless veterans. Danny was considering military service himself, though he'd never admit that Sarah Chen's example had influenced his thinking. Jake had started a fundraising campaign at his high school to support local veterans organizations. None of them ever spoke publicly about the encounter at the bus stop, but all three carried the lesson forward in their own ways. They'd learned that strength wasn't about dominating weaker people, but about protecting those who needed protection. They'd discovered that real heroes often looked nothing like the movies suggested, and that courage came in many forms, including the willingness to change when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Sarah Chen graduated from West Point the following spring and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Rangers, continuing a family tradition of military service that stretched back 3 generations. She never contacted the 3 teenagers again, having made her point about consequences and moved on to more important missions. But she did visit Bobby Martinez occasionally, when she was home on leave, checking on the elderly veteran who'd unknowingly become the catalyst for her lesson about respect and responsibility. Bobby always seemed surprised but pleased by her visits, grateful for the attention from someone who understood the weight that old soldiers carried. During one of these visits, Bobby asked her why she'd intervened at the bus stop that morning. Lots of people would have just kept walking, he said. Figured it wasn't their business. Sarah considered the question while sipping coffee in Bobby's small apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions of a man who'd spent 50 years trying to make peace with memories that wouldn't stay buried. My grandfather died at 19, she said finally. Never got to come home, never got to have a family, never got to see what his sacrifice made possible. You did come home. You survived things that killed better men than those kids could ever be. That makes you living proof that his death meant something. She paused, staring out the window at the parking lot where 3 teenagers had learned an important lesson about consequences and character. Besides, she added with a smile that carried both warmth and steel, somebody had to teach those boys that actions have consequences. Better they learn it from me than from life. What Bobby Martinez never knew, what the 3 teenagers never suspected, and what Sarah Chen would take to her grave, was that the encounter at the bus stop hadn't been random at all. She'd been following Tyler Brennan and his friends for 3 weeks, documenting their pattern of targeting vulnerable people for social media entertainment. Tyler, Danny, and Jake had made a habit of filming themselves bullying homeless individuals, elderly pedestrians, and anyone they perceived as weak or defenseless. Their TikTok and Instagram accounts were filled with videos of casual cruelty disguised as comedy, earning them followers who enjoyed watching others suffer. Sarah had been building a case against them, collecting evidence for what she'd planned, to be a comprehensive exposure of their behavior to school administrators, parents, and law enforcement. But when she saw them target Bobby Martinez, a Vietnam veteran whose service record she'd researched after seeing him at previous incidents, her carefully planned investigation had given way to immediate intervention. The random encounter at the bus stop had actually been the culmination of a 3-week surveillance operation conducted by a West Point cadet who decided that some lessons couldn't wait for official channels to address.